Welcome to the Deep Dive. We tackle complex global topics, aiming to give you, well, the clearest insights we can. Today, we're diving into the Chinese economy. It's a real puzzle, isn't it? Something that seems to challenge a lot of preconceived notions. For years, people have tried to stick a simple label on it. Is it communist? Is it capitalist? Or something else entirely? The truth, as we'll explore today, is, well, way more complex. And maybe that whole categorization exercise kind of misses the point, according to our main source. To help us untangle this, we're drawing heavily on the work of Keyu Jin. She's a renowned economist, associate professor at the London School of Economics, and her perspective is, frankly, quite unique. It really challenges how many of us instinctively think about China's economic power. So, our mission today: to really unpack Jin's ideas, we want to explore her argument that China's economy just doesn't fit those traditional labels. We'll also look at how it responded, maybe surprisingly, to things like the trade tensions under the Trump administration and the big challenges it still faces, fitting into this increasingly complex multipolar world. Basically, a shortcut to getting better informed on a huge global player. Okay, so let's unpack this first big idea. Jin starts by challenging how we even categorize China. Most people try to force it into, like, a communist box or a capitalist box, but she says that's just way too simple. What's her alternative view?
Well, Jin argues pretty strongly that China represents a really dynamic hybrid system. It's not just a mix, it's this constant interplay. So on one hand, you absolutely have strong state control. The Communist Party's leadership is central, guiding economic planning, directing resources, coordinating these massive infrastructure projects. You definitely see that.
Right, that sounds pretty much like a classic command economy structure. But you said hybrid, so how does that strong state control actually coexist with the market side? The private initiative, the entrepreneurship that we've seen explode since the reform started back in '78. How do they fit together?
That's really the core of it. It somehow integrates those very vibrant market dynamics quite seamlessly, or maybe surprisingly seamlessly. Think of it like two engines working together. The state sets the long-term strategic direction, provides stability, maybe the big infrastructure. But then private initiative, entrepreneurs, foreign investment, very capitalist elements, right? They drive a huge amount of the day-to-day innovation and growth. And Jin argues this specific combination, using both state coordination and market flexibility, that's the real engine behind its incredible growth. The tech giants, the massive middle class.
And there's a fascinating point she makes about internal competition, isn't there? Most people outside China might assume a state-controlled system must be inefficient, top-down, rigid. But she talks about competition among local governments driving efficiency. How does that actually work?
Yeah, it's a really interesting mechanism she highlights. It's like an internal race. Local governments often have incentives, targets to attract investment, create jobs, develop their specific regions. So they end up competing with each other for resources, for talent, trying to get favorable policies from the center. And this competition, it fosters this kind of regional dynamism, a push for development driven from below, in a way. Even though it's under the big umbrella of state guidance, it definitely complicates that simple state control picture.
That insight really does challenge assumptions, doesn't it, about how a big, centrally guided economy can still have these internal competitive drivers. But of course, Jin acknowledges this model isn't perfect. It has challenges, like the recent economic slowdown we've seen and the impact of certain strict regulations sometimes hitting private sector confidence. She sees those too. Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting for me: how Jin interprets the impact of those Trump-era tariffs. Most observers, I think, expected them to seriously weaken China's economy. You probably remember, starting back in 2018, the U.S. put tariffs on, well, loads of Chinese goods. They kept increasing. The stated goals were things like reducing the U.S. trade deficit, protecting American industry, addressing tech transfer concerns. But Jin argues the outcome was, well, almost the opposite.
Exactly. Her core argument is really counterintuitive. She says, far from weakening China, those tariffs acted more like a catalyst for its economic transformation. It's almost a textbook case of unintended consequences, where this external pressure actually forced internal strengthening.
A catalyst. That's the paradox, right? Because normally you'd think tariffs would constrain things, slow things down. So what specific changes or mechanisms does Jin point to? How did tariffs end up being a catalyst instead of just a drag?
Well, the main thing was diversification. It forced it. Chinese companies, suddenly facing these higher barriers to the huge U.S. market, they had to scramble. They aggressively looked for new places to sell their goods, so you saw exports to countries like Mexico, Vietnam, Thailand ramp up really quickly. And that, in turn, reduced China's reliance on the U.S. market, made their export base more resilient. And at the same time, The pressure sped up technological innovation. Instead of just importing or licensing foreign tech, there was a huge push. Chinese companies poured money into R&D, aiming for self-sufficiency in really critical areas. Think AI, semiconductors, that kind of thing. And it also pushes them to strengthen their own domestic supply chains, make them less vulnerable if, global trade gets disrupted again.
So while China was going through this kind of forced evolution, what does Jin say the effects were back in the United States?
Jin points out that the tariffs often had, well, negative consequences right here in the U.S. For instance, higher prices for American consumers because those duties often just got passed along. And potentially job losses, too, in some U.S. sectors manufacturing, retail that depended on Chinese parts or sold Chinese goods. So if you look at the big picture, Jin's analysis basically says the tariffs didn't really achieve Trump's main strategic goals, like shrinking the trade deficit significantly or bringing back lots of manufacturing jobs. Instead, kind of unexpectedly, they ended up strengthening China's position in the global economy, made it tougher, more self-reliant.
That's quite an assessment. So given those surprising outcomes from the tariffs, how has China's broader strategy evolved, thinking beyond just tariffs to the ongoing U.S.-China tensions? We know the U.S. has other concerns too, accusations about things like state subsidies, intellectual property issues.
Right. And in response to all that pressure, China has really leaned into what they call the double circulation strategy. It's a key concept Jin discusses. You can sort of think of it as building up two engines. One is a really strong domestic economic engine boosting internal consumption, developing homegrown technology, making internal supply chains really robust. But, and this is crucial, while also keeping the global trade routes open, fostering its international presence. The dual aspect. This gives China more flexibility. If external pressures, like sanctions, get really intense, they can rely more on that internal engine. But they don't want to cut themselves off either.
And it sounds like U.S. actions, particularly things like export controls on advanced semiconductors, have actually just pushed China harder towards technological independence.
Precisely. Those restrictions have been a powerful motivator, frankly. They created this real urgency for China to develop its own advanced chip-making abilities and other core technologies. It lit a fire under them. And we're seeing a broader shift, too, a kind of global reorientation. China's been increasing investment significantly in places like Europe and Asia, setting up production facilities, R&D centers. It reflects a clear move towards operating in a world with multiple power centers, not just relying on the U.S. relationship. And then there's the Belt and Road Initiative, of course, that massive infrastructure project across continents. That's a major tool for boosting its economic influence in Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, further diversifying its global links.
It really does raise that question, doesn't it? How geopolitical pressure can sometimes backfire, pushing a nation towards more self-reliant and maybe new alliances rather than achieving the goal of weakening it, makes you rethink how leverage actually works. Okay, let's circle back then to that fundamental question Jin raises China's economic identity. You said she argues it goes beyond simple labels like communist or capitalist. Can you elaborate a bit more on how she describes this unique blend, where the Communist Party's political control genuinely coexists with things like private property and real market competition?
Yeah, she emphasizes it's not just peaceful coexistence, it's an active, dynamic integration. The state isn't just sitting back, it's providing the strategic direction, pushing capital towards key sectors needed for national development, like green tech or advanced manufacturing. But at the same time, it's deliberately fostering an environment where private companies can innovate and compete, sometimes fiercely. So no, it's not a free-for-all laissez-faire system. But it's definitely not the old-style, monolithic, often inefficient command economy either. It just doesn't fit those molds. And it challenges that Western assumption that this level of state involvement must automatically stifle dynamism or efficiency.
And that point about internal competition among local governments you mentioned earlier, that seems really important here too. How does that specific mechanism reinforce her argument about the model being, well, adaptive and maybe more efficient than we assume, even with state direction?
It really speaks to the system's pragmatism, its focus on results. The central government might set broad goals, GDP targets, tech milestones, whatever, but then local governments often have significant autonomy, and like we said, they compete intensely to hit those targets or even exceed them. They experiment with local policies, try to attract the best companies. This creates a sort of internal dynamism, a responsiveness. It allows the system to adapt and learn, constantly looking for ways to be more effective, even within that state-guided framework. It's a key feature Jin highlights.
But she also acknowledges, as you said, that this adaptive system is under stress right now. We've definitely seen regulatory crackdowns recently, especially on big tech companies. How does Jin frame these actions? Does she see them as a fundamental shift or a challenge the model has to navigate?
She identifies them as a very real challenge, absolutely. These regulatory moves have created genuine uncertainty. They've spooked some investors, led to some capital outflow, and definitely dampened confidence in parts of the private sector. Jin seems to view this as a critical test for the model right now. How does the state maintain its strategic control and address concerns like inequality or data security without killing the golden goose, without stifling the very innovation and entrepreneurship that powered so much growth? It's a balancing act, a really difficult one, and she points that out clearly.
So, pulling it all together, what are the big takeaways then, according to Keyu Jin's analysis, for where China is headed? It feels like we end up with this strategic paradox where external pressure, like the tariffs, didn't have the intended effect but actually spurred resilience.
That's a major takeaway, yes. Jin's view is that those Trump policies, aiming to weaken China, paradoxically ended up accelerating its economic transformation. They forced diversification, pushed tech investment forward faster than might have happened otherwise. She even makes the point that some U.S. demands, thinking longer term, like pushing for stronger intellectual property protection, could ultimately benefit China itself. How? By encouraging more domestic innovation, creating a more level playing field internally, maybe pushing further liberalization within their own system down the line.
Interesting. And she also has a warning for the U.S. side in all this, doesn't she?
She does. Jin cautions that if the U.S. continues down a strongly protectionist path, it risks consequences at home. Things like higher prices for American consumers, as we discussed, and potentially a loss of competitiveness for U.S. exports, partly because if demand for U.S. goods falls, the dollar could appreciate, making exports more expensive. It's that reminder that economic actions usually cut both ways.
But looking at China itself, it's not like it's smooth sailing ahead. Jin clearly identifies some pretty crucial challenges they need to manage. What are the big ones on her list?
Oh yeah, she flags several critical issues. First, there's the economic slowdown they're currently grappling with. They need to address that to keep confidence up, both domestically and internationally. Second, related to that, is the risk of capital flight. If uncertainty persists, especially around regulations in the private sector, money might continue to flow out, which is a drag. Third, despite all the progress, there's still some technological dependence on foreign suppliers for certain key components or technologies. That leaves them vulnerable to sanctions. Fourth, obviously, are the ongoing geopolitical tensions, the relationship with the U.S., with other Western countries, navigating protectionism elsewhere. That's a constant challenge. And maybe underlying all of that is the fifth point, finding that sustainable balance between state control and economic liberalization. How much direction versus how much freedom. Getting that wrong could stifle innovation or lead to instability. It's the core dilemma.
So, connecting all these threads, Jin's analysis seems to offer a really nuanced view. It's not doom and gloom, but it's not purely celebratory either. Maybe be cautiously optimistic about China's resilience.
I think that's fair. It's nuanced and, yes, ultimately perhaps cautiously optimistic about China's adaptability. She portrays a system that has shown a remarkable ability to adjust and evolve under pressure. Her conclusion seems to be that China is likely well-positioned to play a central role in the global economy for the foreseeable future, provided it can successfully navigate these really complex internal and external dynamics we've just discussed. It's a big if, but the track record suggests they're capable of adaptation.
Okay, so to sum up Keyu Jin's perspective then, China's economy isn't some fixed thing, not easily definable by an ELSM. It's complex, it's shown itself to be incredibly resilient, highly adaptable, a system that has really transformed, often in surprising ways, partly because of external pressures. It's this unique blend that just defies simple labels and really requires us to look deeper. So here's something to think about as we wrap up. As you consider China's path forward, this evolving hybrid economic giant, how do you think other global powers might need to adapt their strategies, especially if applying pressure keeps leading to these unexpected, sometimes strengthening outcomes for China and maybe unexpected consequences for everyone involved? It really makes you wonder about the long game in this global economic chess match. What does effective strategy even look like in that context?